The transmission in the Forest Service 3/4 ton was slipping on the third switchback above Vallecito, the whole dashboard rattling with a dry plastic chatter that made me want to kid it through the firewall. I didn't. You don't kick gear when you're $3,000 short of a payroll draw, and the collection agent from First National has started calling your crew's emergency contact numbers because you stopped answering yours. Fluids burning, Brody said. He was 24, his knuckles stained gray from 3 seasons of dry stone masonry, his knees already showing the stiff, hitching limp of a man who carried 80 pounds of dynamic load over deadfall for 5 months a year. We're going to lose the low band if you keep her in second. We lose second, we don't make the basin, I said, my thumb jammed against the steering wheel until the nail turned white. We don't make the basin. The district ranger signs the default order by 5 o'clock Friday. Then none of us has an account to deposit into. Brody didn't answer. He reached down, picked up a 2-inch steel shackle from the floorboards, and began spinning the threaded pin in and out, a rhythmic, metallic click that filled the basin with a captive sacrifice that ramps up into the distance and rushes it. In the back seat, Maya was checking the seals on the fuel canisters for the Pionjar drills. She was the only one who had worked the high alpine with me during the 23 season, back when the snow didn't clear until mid-July and the ground stayed like grease until the hard freezes in August. Beside her, Ben, a green kid from the state university who still smelled like clean laundry, was staring out the bug-splattered glass at the yellowing aspens. He didn't know yet that at 11,000 feet, the air doesn't just make you tired, it makes you stupid. It makes your decisions feel long and heavy, like you're trying to think through a wet wool blanket. We were headed for the northern boundary of the Weminuche Wilderness, a high horseshoe-shaped basin called Dead Man's Notch on the old survey plates, though the Forest Service maps just listed it as Compartment 402. A late winter avalanche, a massive slab that had pulled 500 tons of granite off the western ridge, had taken out 80 yards of the primary pack trail. The district had put out an emergency high-hazard contract, $42,000, with a $10,000 completion bonus if the line was certified clear before the first October dump. My house in Durango was 3 weeks from the courthouse steps. My truck was on its third retread. I had $18 in my front pocket and a notice in my glove box stating that my commercial liability insurance would terminate if I didn't verify a wire transfer by the first of the month. When the tires finally hit the gravel turnout at the trailhead, the silence hit us like a physical blow. The engine gave one long, dying hiss of hot coolant and stopped. I swung my legs out, my boots sinking into the loose loam of the lodgepole floor. The air was thin, sharp with the smell of frozen resin and the dry and mineral dust of the high country. I took a long breath. The low, throbbing ache behind my eyes, the one that had been there since the bank sent the certified letter, didn't go away, but it moved. It went from a panicked, spinning thing to a hard, cold knot at the base of my skull. "Brody, get the rigging lines," I said, my voice flat against the timber. "Maya, you've got the fuel and the first aid kit. Ben, if you drop that survey transit, you're walking the 5 miles back to the blacktop. Let's move." The ascent took 4 hours. At Timberline, the trees lost their height, twisting into the low, stunted shapes of Krummholz, shattered, gray wood that looked like it had been beaten into the rock by a century of wind. The basin opened up above 11,000 feet like a giant stone palm. To our left, the western ridge rose 600 feet of sheer, fractured granite. To our right, the eastern ridge ran parallel, a long, knife-edge wall of shifting scree. Between them lay a half-mile of wide, flat alpine meadow, green gold with dying sedge grass, cut through the middle by a seasonal creek that was already reduced to a thin ribbon of black ice. At the western lip of the basin sat the 1,890 stone boundary monument. It was a historic marker, 3 feet high, built of flat slabs of native hornblende by the old General Land Office surveyors. It was set into the living bedrock with 2-inch iron drift pins that had rusted to a deep, dark orange. I dropped my 60-pound pack against the base of the cairn. The stone felt cold, solid, unyielding. For 14 years, these monuments had been the only things in my life that didn't shift. A line run between two historical markers was absolute. It was law. It was mathematics. It was money. "Brody," I called out, unbuckling the leather case of the engineering log. "Take the spool. We need the benchmark across the slide before we start the masonry rows." Brody nodded, spitting a dark stream of tobacco juice into the scree. He slung the heavy wire wheel over his shoulder. 4,000 feet of high-tensile aircraft cable, 1/16 of an inch thick, used for setting straight visual lines across big voids. He picked up his radio from his belt. "I'm heading across. Give me 20 minutes to clear the willow bough." I looked back at the winch. The drum was maxed out. There were no more teeth left on the gear. I reached down and touched the wire. It was loose enough to swing in the wind like a laundry line. "That's impossible," I muttered. I pulled the 1980 USGS topo map from my case, my thumb tracing the red hatch lines of the survey contract. The distance between the two monuments was recorded as exactly 2,640 feet, half a mile. I had 4,000 feet on the spool, and I'd cut the lead at 3,000 to give us plenty of tail for the tensioner. "Ben," I said, my voice sharper than I intended, "bring the laser rangefinder here." The kid stumbled over, his boots catching on a root. He handed me the yellow plastic housing. I aimed the red dot across the valley, tracking the gray rock until I found the tiny orange speck of Brody's vest against the eastern wall. I pressed the trigger. The screen blinked. 2,642 feet. I wiped the lens with my sleeve and shot it again. 2,642 feet. "He's on the wrong stone," I said, the irritation rising hot in my throat. We were losing the light, the shadow of the western ridge already cold across our boots. "Brody, you're on the wrong cairn. You're 2 feet off the datum. Check the section number on the cap." The radio stayed silent for 5 long seconds. When Brody came back, his voice had that hard, stubborn edge of a worker who doesn't like being called blind by the guy who signs the checks. "David, there's only one monument within a mile of this ridge. It's the 1890 Browns Disc, Department of the Interior. I'm looking right at it. If the line's long, you didn't spool enough wire." "I spooled 3,000 feet myself, Brody. The math doesn't lie." "Well, something's lying," he said, "because the wire's in the dirt and I'm out of tail." "Leave it," I snapped. The cold was coming down fast now, the thermometer on my pack already dropping through 40 degrees. Tie it off where it is. We'll recalibrate at first light. Maya, get the tents up. We're in the center meadow. We pitched the 4 tents in a straight row in the middle of the valley floor, where the soil was deep enough to take the aluminum stakes without hitting shale. I wanted the crew close together. Out here, if someone gets altitude sickness or a midnight appendix attack, you don't want to be hunting through a quarter-mile of darkness to find them. We ate our freeze-dried beef in silence, the blue hiss of the MSR stove the only sound in the basin. The slack steel cable lay 20 feet away, a long, dull gray snake through the grass, catching the last reflection of the purple sky. I lay in my bag with my headlamp on, tracking the figures in my ledger. If we cleared 3 cubic yards of rock a day, if the weather held until the 10th, if Brody didn't lose his temper and walk off the job. I must have dropped off around midnight. I woke up because I was cold, not the normal creeping chill of a nylon tent, but the hard, wet cold of the earth against my hip. I reached out in the dark to adjust my foam sleeping pad, but my hand didn't find the flat nylon floor. It found a slope. I was leaning to the left, my shoulder pressed hard against the tent wall, my deer bag sliding down into the corner by my feet. I sat up, my heart doing a strange, irregular flutter in my ribs. I turned on my headlamp. The floor of my mountain hardware tent was buckled. A long, smooth ridge of dirt was rising directly through the center of the floor space, lifting the nylon fabric until it was tight as a drumhead. From outside, a sharp ping rang through the dark. It sounded like a high-caliber rifle shot. "David!" It was Maya. Her voice was thin, high with that specific pitch people use when they're trying not to scream. I unzipped the fly, my boots slipping on the steep, wet incline that had been a perfectly level meadow 6 hours before. The air hit me like a bucket of ice water. The temperature had plummeted, but the air felt thick, heavy, like the atmosphere in a root cellar before a summer storm. My headlamp beam cut through the dark. Maya was standing outside her tent, in her long underwear, her bare feet jammed into unlaced pack boots. Her tent was listing 40 degrees to the east, the 3/8-inch aluminum poles bent into a violent horseshoe curve. "The stakes," she whispered, pointing her light at the ground. "David, look at the stakes." I looked down. The heavy forged steel stakes we used for the guy lines hadn't been pulled out of the ground. The ground had ejected them. They lay on top of the crushed sedge grass, their hooks clean, the soil beneath them smooth and undisturbed, as if the earth had simply unclasped its fingers and let them go. Brody and Ben were out now, their headlamps sweeping the valley floor like lighthouse beams. "What the hell did you do to the line, David?" Brody called out. He was standing near the creek bed, his light pointed at the steel wire we'd left slack. I walked over, my boots sinking into soil that felt strange, elastic, almost, under my weight. Every step felt like walking on an old mattress. The steel wire wasn't sagging anymore. It was 4 feet off the ground, pulled so tight it didn't even move in the wind. It was vibrating, a high, thin, rhythmic hum that you could feel in the fillings of your teeth. The steel was shiny, the zinc coating scraping off in tiny, silvery flakes under the immense tension. "The winch is locked," I said, my voice dropping into that quiet, careful register you use when you realize you're standing on a live charge. The drum was full. It couldn't take another inch. "It didn't take an inch," Brody said. He walked closer, his light tracking the cable toward the western wall. "Look at the willow brush." The dense thickets of subalpine willow that grew along the creek, low, woody shrubs that usually stood 4 feet high, were different. They weren't broken, they were overlapping. The branches were braided together like the fingers of 2 hands being pressed together in prayer, the leaves crushed into a thick, wet mash that smelled like vinegar. "Ben," I said, turning back toward the tents, "get the transit, now." The boy didn't move. He was staring at the northern end of the basin, his mouth slightly open, his head tipped back. "Where's the pass?" he asked. "What are you talking about?" "The pass is straight ahead, 500 yards. "No," Ben said. His voice was flat, empty of the panic that was starting to chew at the rest of us. "It's not." I took the light from his hand and swung it north. The northern saddle, the wide, clear gravel opening where the trail dropped down into the Animus drainage, was gone. In its place rose a jagged, vertical seam of gray granite, the two flanking walls of the basin meeting like the jaws of a vise. The two ridges hadn't slid. They hadn't broken in a rockfall. They were simply together. A jagged 2-foot crack was all that remained of the 200-yard pass, and out of that crack, a high, whistling scream of compressed air was tearing through the night, a sound so loud it made my ears ring. "Back it up," I said. My voice was too quiet, but it had that iron authority that comes when you stop thinking about the money and start thinking about the box they carry you out in. Everything we need, survival gear, first aid, the log, leave the tents, the drills. Maya said, her eyes wide in the headlamp glare. "David, those are $3,000 apiece on my personal voucher. If we leave the tools, I don't give a shit about the vouchers, Maya. Pack the food and the water. We're moving south. We go over the knife edge if we have to. We can't go over the knife edge with 60-pound packs in the dark," Brody said. He had his hand on the steel wire, his fingers feeling the vibration. "David, the wire's getting hotter." He was right. I touched the steel. It was warm, like an old radiator. The lateral pressure was doing something to the metal, stretching the molecular bonds as the distance between the two stone monuments, the two unyielding, absolute anchors of the world, continued to disappear. A low, deep groan started beneath our feet. It wasn't the sharp crack of an earthquake. It was a wet, tearing sound, like 1,000 pairs of old jeans being ripped apart at the seams all at once. 50 yards away, in the beam of my light, a mature subalpine fir, a tree with a trunk as thick as my waist and roots that went 10 feet into the granite fissures, gave a sudden violent shudder. The ground around its base buckled upward, the soil lifting in a 3-foot wave of sod and stone. The tree didn't fall over, it was pushed. It rose vertically out of its own hole, its root architecture exposed, gray and twisting like a nest of worms. Before the trunk snapped cleanly, the collar with a sound like a small mortar going off. "Move!" I yelled, grabbing Ben by the shoulder strap of his pack and shoving himself. "Get to the scree slope! Get off the meadow!" We ran. The ground beneath our boots was no longer flat. It was folding. Every 10 feet, a new ridge of sod would lift out of the grass. 3-foot-high waves of compressed earth that looked like a green rug being pushed against a wall by a heavy boot. We were tripping, falling into the troughs, our shins bruised by the rocks that were being squeezed out of the dirt like watermelon seeds. The air was getting harder to breathe. My lungs felt flat, dry, as if I were trying to inhale through a straw. I looked down at my Casio altimeter watch. The digital face read 10,200 feet. We had started at 11,500. We hadn't descended a single foot of elevation. We were still standing on the same grass, but the barometric pressure was climbing so fast my ears were popping every 3 seconds. A sharp, painful click inside my skull. The atmosphere was being trapped in the closing basin, the volume of the valley shrinking faster than the air could whistle out of the northern crack. "David!" Maya screamed from behind. I turned my light back. She was down. Her left leg disappeared into a narrow, dark slot that had split through the shale. "I'm stuck. My frame, the pack's wedged." Brody and I dropped to our knees beside her. The crevice wasn't wide, maybe 18 inches, but the sides were smooth, raw gray granite that had never seen the sun, and they were moving. It wasn't a speed you could see with your eyes, but you could hear it. A dry, grinding crick, 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 as the stone lips came together. The aluminum frame of her external pack was already deformed, the metal tubes whistling as they were flattened against the granite wall. "Unbuckle!" I shouted, my fingers digging into the stiff canvas of her chest strap. The plastic quick-release buckle was jammed, under too much load from the closing stone. "Maya, don't move!" I pulled my rigging knife, a 3-inch carbon steel blade I'd carried since my days in the Backcountry Rangers, and sliced through the heavy nylon webbing. The blade cut clean, the tension on the straps so high they snapped back like whips, leaving long red welts across my knuckles. I grabbed her under the armpits and pulled. Brody took her hands. With one long wet screech of tearing fabric, Maya came loose, her body sliding out of the harness just as the two rock walls met. The pack, our satellite communicator, our food, our water, our only link to the district office, was caught between them. The stone didn't stop. It kept closing until the aluminum frame was a flat sheet of silver metal and the canvas was a dark stain on the granite, the oil from the small stove fuel can oozing out of the crack like blood from a crushed finger. "Jesus," Brody whispered, his light shaking so badly the beam bounced across the cliffs. "David, look up," Ben said. He was sitting on the shale, his hands gripped around his knees, his face completely blank. We looked up. The sky was almost gone. The eastern and western ridges, which had stood half a mile apart when we arrived, were leaning inward at an impossible, terrifying angle. The stars were being blotted out by the dark, massive profiles of the peaks, until only a thin, jagged ribbon of pale purple light remained, directly overhead, no wider than a state highway. The mountains looked like the walls of an open grave that was slowly, methodically being driven shut. The temperature was freezing now, the cold so intense it made our breath come out in thick white clouds that didn't disperse. They just hung in the heavy pressurized air around our faces. "The Southern Monument," I said, my teeth chattering so hard I could barely form the words. "The line runs to the boundary gate. If we can get to the 0 point, if we can get past the old stone line." "There is no line, David," Brody shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "The maps are gone. The pack's gone. We're dying in a hole that isn't on the grid." "Climb!" I screamed, grabbing him by the collar of his jacket and throwing him toward the southern slope. "You want to stay here and get turned into gravel? Climb!" The final 300 yards were the worst hours of my life. The shale slope was dynamic. Every time we kicked a stone loose, it didn't roll down the mountain. It didn't follow gravity. It drifted sideways, drawn toward the center of the narrowing gap by some localized mass shift that I couldn't understand and didn't want to. Some fear of life was good and timeless.
The rocks clicked against each other, small, flat pieces of slate sliding across the mountain like checkers on a tilted board. Ben stopped halfway up. He didn't cry. He didn't scream.
He just lay down on his stomach, his fingers dug into the loose dirt, his face pressed into the shale. When I tried to pull him up, he was rigid, his muscles locked in a catatonic terror that no amount of shouting could break. I slung him over my shoulder like a deer carcass, my knees cracking under the double weight, my lungs burning from the thick, heavy air. Every breath felt like swallowing sand. My altimeter watch was spinning backwards now. 9,500, 9,200, 8,900, even though we were climbing toward the highest ridge. When we finally reached the crest of the southern ridge, the space had narrowed to a hallway. To my left, the Western Monument, the 1,890 cairn we'd left 4 hours ago, was right there. It hadn't stayed half a mile away. It had traveled across the valley floor, or the valley floor had traveled through it. It was 20 feet from its eastern twin. The two stone pillars, built by men who'd been dead for 80 years, were vibrating. The dry stone masonry was shedding its mortar, the flat rocks sliding over each other like cards in a deck. A deep, subaudible hum was coming out of the bedrock, a sound so heavy it vibrated the face of the earth. I grabbed Ben by the hauling loop of his harness, lifted him with the last strength I had in my legs, and threw him across the gap. He landed like a sack of wet laundry on top of Brody. I didn't have time to set my feet. The rock beneath my heels, the ancient, unyielding granite of the San Juan National Forest, simply wasn't there anymore. It didn't fall, it disappeared, the edge of the world moving inward faster than a man could step back. I lunged forward, my arms extended, my boots pushing off nothing but empty, whistling air. I hit the grass hard, the breath knocking out of my lungs in one loud, wet grunt. I rolled down a gentle 3-foot slope, the green sedge grass cool against my cheek, the smell of normal, damp pine needles filling my nose. I lay there for a long time, my fingers dug into the dirt, waiting for the ground to fold. It didn't. The grass stayed flat. The air was light, cool, thin, the normal, clean air of an 11,000-foot ridge in September. My ears gave one loud, painful pop, and the pressure behind my eyes vanished. I turned over slowly, my joints aching as if I'd been beaten with a lead pipe. Brody was sitting 3 feet away, his arm wrapped around Maya's shoulders. Ben was face down in the grass, his hands still clenched into fists, but his breathing had slowed to a steady, rhythmic rise and fall. We all looked back up the hill, where the 3-mile alpine basin of Dead Man's Notch had been since the last ice age. There was only a flat, seamless wall of gray hornblende granite. It was smooth, weathered, covered in ancient orange crustous lichen that took 500 years to grow. There was no seam, no crack, no sign that the earth had ever been open there. A quarter-mile down the Velocito Trail, a man and a woman were walking up the switchbacks. They wore bright blue fleece jackets, and their trekking poles made a clean, regular tick-tick-tick sound against the gravel. The woman was laughing at something the man had said. They didn't look up at the ridge. They didn't look at us. They just kept walking, enjoying the early morning sun on their way to the high lakes. The Forest Service didn't buy the report. They sent a district surveyor out 2 weeks later, a guy named Miller who had worked the regional office since the 90s. He stood on the Velocito side with a digital total station and a stack of historical plat sheets, his face hard and sour under his green ball cap. "The contract says compartment 402, David," he told me, his thumb ticking the clip of his mechanical pencil. "You abandoned $3,000 of government-issued drilling gear and $42,000 of contracted trail masonry. The default order stands." "Look at the map, Miller," I said. My hands were jammed into my pockets so he wouldn't see the way the fingers still shook when I stayed in one place too long. "The acreage doesn't match the 1982 survey. You're missing 80 rods on the northern line. The 1982 survey had a 3% error margin on the high ridges, David. Everyone knows that. The mountains don't move." I didn't say they moved. I said they closed. I said they closed. I said they closed. He just looked at me then, that long, pitying look professionals give a guy who spent too many seasons above timberline without a hat. "Go home, David," he said. "Get some air." I didn't tell him that I don't have a home anymore. The foreclosure went through 3 days after we came off the mountain. My truck is parked behind a diesel garage in Ignacio because I can't pay the transmission shop for the new low gear. I live in a small rental trailer outside of Aztec now, where the country is flat and dry and the dirt stays where it belongs. I don't go into the mountains anymore. I don't even like looking at the horizon when the weather clears and you can see the big white peaks of the San Juans 80 miles to the north. But what keeps me awake, what makes me sit up at 3 in the morning with my skin cold and my breath short, isn't the thought of the money I owe or the gear we left behind in the dark. It's the tape measure in my kitchen drawer. Sometimes, when the trailer gets quiet and the wind stops coming through the oil heaters, I'll pull that yellow metal tape out to 12 inches. I'll look at the black lines on the steel, the little red numbers that mark the fractions of an inch, the absolute constants we use to build tables and doors and walls. And then I'll look at the corners of my living room, wondering if the distance between them is still exactly what the landlord said it was when I signed the lease.